of anticipation, we really are happy to have you here on this hybrid occasion. Just before we start formally, may I indicate that if you need restrooms, you'll have to walk back towards reception, and outside of those doors, just behind the lifts, there are those facilities. And as good practice, as a reminder, let's please be muted, whatever device you are using. And this is a learning space, a learning engagement that is safe, and we encourage you to really take full advantage of one of such special occasions that we're able to have you as recurring partners in the NSG with us, and in your widening of the footprint to bring us more, so that no one is left behind in our continuing learning and development. My name is Millie Baile, and on behalf of the National School of Government, I really wish to welcome you all. Today, interestingly, this day, the 5th of April, 5 years ago, was marked through a resolution of the UN General Assembly as the International Day of Conscience, in recognition of the significance of the human conscience in, for example, contributing to the promotion of peace in love, in conscience. It's a trait, it's a characteristic, it's a capability and capacity that sets us apart from the rest of the physical creation. Through it, we have an inner sense of right and wrong, but conscience is not mutually exclusive of, it's not the opposite of intellectual capacity. It is not the opposite of discretion. In fact, we need to strengthen it. We need to refine it based on shared values. We also need to test it according to evidence of what is appropriate, what is beneficial, not just for self, not just in the short term, but for the greater good, for people and planet, based on evidence. Evidence is the key word in today's conversation. Evidence is a strong feature in disciplines and domains of science, in law, in auditing, and so on. Evidence is also a feature in practices of research, analysis, writing, decision-making, discretionary determination of services, and in governance overall. So with a bias towards the public sector, we are welcoming once more each one of you here and those tied in virtually to our masterclass today on the theme, effective use of evidence for planning and execution diligence. Timely, this masterclass theme is. April being the beginning of a new financial year, giving us opportunities to revisit, to reestablish the appropriateness of our strategies, our programs, our policies, our plans. Also an opportunity for us to re-examine our commitments, check that vital stats of our conscience towards our commitment to service, making meaningful impact. So I don't have evidence yet, but I'm inclined to say you agree with me that we can't wait to hear what constitutes evidence, of what kind, for what use, under what circumstances, with what contestations. Also, in particular, the significance and the effect of evidence with regard to policy making, planning, execution. So, ladies and gentlemen, our esteemed guests, our colleagues, may I call on you, through you, call on our Director General, the Principal of the National School of Government, Professor Busane Ngaweni, to introduce our key input maker. Thank you.
Good morning, colleagues. Thanks, Prof. Paile. Colleagues, we are all welcome here to the NSG. Those who are here in the room, the the commissioner from the Public Service Commission, Commissioner Ngwenya. We are welcome to the NSG. You've been here before. The main input maker today, uh, Kubenai, the former governor of the Reserve Bank, the DGs who are here, and all the colleagues who are on the Zoom platform, including the ministers who are joining us. I did indicate to Kuben earlier on that everybody who's here, including the ministers today, they are students, including the DGs. So I will dispense with the protocol. Commissioner says we are all welcome and protocol observed, and that he will be engaging with everybody else here as a person who's here to learn. We're excited to have all of you here. We will post the bios of everybody who is we will be making an input today on the Zoom platform. I know DG Justice is already on the Zoom platform there following this kind of stuff and others. So I'm not going to be reading all the full bios as it were. Safe to say that our main guest, and I'm happy to announce he has agreed that he could serve as a fellow of the National School of Government. So we will have Kuben Naidu as a fellow of the NSG, where he can create content, he can teach at ministerial level and above, and of course the colleagues who are here, the DGs and others, as part of creating content and deepening the depth and the content of the work of the NSG. He's a former deputy governor. He's currently on garden leave. I don't know what garden leave looks like. I think it's a nice thing, to be on, garden leave. I'm taking a sabbatical myself soon. I don't know whether it's called garden leave. And he's worked in various capacities in National Treasury as well as in the presidency, and he brings a wealth of expertise. The reason, Kuben, I thought you would engage around this topic of effective use of evidence is because some years ago, when I joined government by coincidence, and I used to interact with the colleagues from National Treasury, one thing I understood and admired about you was how you were always, in every input you make, you were dealing with evidence as a point of reference. There were many other people with the treasury. Some of them will use the prescripts, they throw the book at you, the authority of treasury and so on. But Kubenaidu never did that. I own experience, and I had a dream that one day I could be like you and master the numbers and use numbers to foreground the discussions around policies. And that's why we thought you could engage with that topic, because today we know people make decisions based on common sense. There's still a lot of common sense around. The state mega, multi-billion rand decision can be made just based on common sense without any shred of evidence being used. Not just evidence that tells us where we are, but also, beginning to do some probabilities of where we want to be. And I know that when you were leading the process of writing the National Development Plan, he wrote it, by the way, that this is the guy who wrote the NDP. Or you didn't know? Well, now you know. Yeah, so the document that Dino quotes a lot, which was a precursor to the NDP, Dino Punsami, was written by this guy. So, and there was a lot of evidence work that went into writing the diagnostic document and subsequent outputs out of it. So we do welcome you. We welcome the commissioner of the Public Service Commission. We welcome DG of Justice, who's our present guest. We do welcome the two DGs of Limpopo and DPME who are here to engage, as well as all those who are joining us on the platform. Enjoy.
Okay, great. Good morning, everybody. My name is Kuben, and I'm going to be talking a little bit today about evidence and policy making. Let me just see, how do we get the presentation up? Just a couple of sort of words of filibuster. Please, let's try and make this as informal as we can. Um, I enjoy a good, robust interaction. I enjoy a good spat debate. So let's keep this as both informal and as interactive as possible. Feel free to raise your hand at any point. I am slightly hard of hearing, so you have to talk louder than Busani normally talks for me to hear you. Right? Just by way of background, I basically had two employers in my life. I worked at the Treasury for 18 years, and I've been working at the Reserve Bank for 11 years. I left the SAB at the end of last year to do something different, which I'm still trying to figure out what it is. But I hope to talk a little bit about the use of evidence in policymaking, to use some of the National Development Plan examples. I'll do one case study in a little bit of detail, but generally I'll introduce some of the other examples. There's quite a bit of feedback. I don't know how we get rid of that. Okay, while the technicians are sorting it out, I'll go on. So what I'm going to cover today is essentially, let me get this here, is essentially some theoretical concepts. But the other thing I want to talk about is why it's actually quite hard to use evidence. If it was easy to use evidence, I'm sure you'd all use evidence all the time to make policy. But it's actually not straightforward to use evidence, right? We'll go into that case study on the ANAs. I'll talk a little bit about COVID as a peculiar case when the evidence was changing every 7 days. Right? Every 7 days, the best scientific evidence is different from a week ago. How do policymakers work under such heightened uncertainty? Right? And what's called the precautionary principle, right? And how do policymakers think about that when they make policy? I thought I'll start off with the quote. Certainly one of my favorite US leaders is FDR, and he made this quote at the bottom. Now, just the context is FDR was running for elections. 1929 was the start of the Great Depression. And he made this quote, "The country needs, and unless I mistake its temper, the country demands bold, persistent experimentation. It is common sense to try a method, to take a method and try it. If it fails, admit it frankly. Try another, but above all, try something." Right? And it is amazing how little experimentation there is in government. It's amazing, right? I mean, I've come across in South Africa, in the public policy environment, I've come across scant few examples where experimentation was actively tried and actively encouraged, right? And then the public servant said, "We tried this, it didn't work, so we're moving on to something else." Right? And I think that's a mindset thing. A couple of more quotes that I'll leave you with. The first by Tony Blair, who came in, and when Tony Blair came into government, you probably heard of Michael Barber and the book Instruction to Deliver, but he came in with a very managerialist approach. In some ways, Mbeki became president in 99 as well, and attempted to copy and mimic a lot of the managerialist approaches of the first Labour government. But he says there, we must make more use of pilot schemes to encourage innovation and test whether they work. We'll ensure that all policies are clearly specified, evaluate the lessons and the failures, and communicate openly about them. Obama, a similar kind of theme. The question we ask is not whether government is too big or too small, but whether it works. Where the answer is yes, let's move on. Where the answer is no, let's end programs. Kevin Rudd was the one of the few Labour Party prime ministers of Australia, in a long line of conservative prime ministers. And he made this point here: policy and evaluation should be driven by analysis of all the available options, not by ideology. We are interested in facts, not fads. While we're getting back to the presentation, I'll tell you a little story about my first week at work. Right, so I joined the Treasury, and Andre Roux was the head of the budget office at the Treasury at the time. Now, Andre was from the Eastern Cape. He was a close associate of Matthew Goniwe from Rhodes University. And Andre was head of the budget office. And on the first week, he says, you see, you political types, you activist types, you must leave your ideology at the door. And I look at him, I say, but I'm here because of my ideology. What do you mean I must leave my ideology at the front door? He says, here there's no room for ideology. Here you serve the country and the Constitution with facts. You leave your political views by the front door. And I challenged him. I said, but I'm here in the public service because of my political views. It took me a long time. It took me probably 20 years to understand what Andre was saying and why he was absolutely right. And Kevin Rudd, in some ways, makes the similar point. We're interested in facts, not fads. We must look at all available options and not be driven by ideology. But I'll come back to that theme later, and we can discuss it later. Right. Here's a nice cartoon I found. They say in government, you don't have evidence-based policy making, you have policy-based evidence making. We make up the facts to support our argument. This is in your pack. I won't go into it. But if there's two takeaways from this picture, is that no matter who you are, and no matter how smart you are, and no matter how experienced you are, you don't know everything. If you come in with the view that I'm the DG, I know everything, you might as well hand in your resignation tomorrow, because you don't. Right? But if you come in with the mindset is, I know some things, I'm a learned person, I'm an experienced person, but actually most of what happens out there in the front line of service delivery, I don't know whether it works or not. And I'm willing to try, I'm willing to experiment. I'm willing to see the evidence of what works and what doesn't. If you come in with that mindset, I think as a public servant, you'll be far more effective than if you come in on day one and said, I'm the Makulu boss here. I know everything. Right? I mean, there's some very basic principles of evidence-based policy making. Again, I won't run into this. I prefer to spend most of the 40 minutes allocated talking about the 2 or 3 case studies and the one in more detail. Build and compile rigorous evidence about what works. Monitor program delivery. Now, let me state up front that there is a huge, what I call M&E army, fad generation. Some of that is necessary, right? Essentially, an M&E approach looks at the way in which you convert your inputs into your outputs. It looks at the way in which you convert your resources into what you're doing. That's important. An M&E approach is important from an accountability point of view. It's important for understanding the relationship between the use of your inputs and your outputs, your policy process. But the evidence that I'm going to talk about mainly is not an M&E approach. It's not about getting people to stand with clipboards and tick off. It's about outcomes. It's about what matters to the public. It often cannot be ascertained by the public servant. The clinic, the nurse working in the clinic is not capable of saying whether there has been a positive outcome of the work that she did or not. Life expectancy in the township might be. The number of maternal deaths in that township might be an indicator, right? Under 5 malnutrition might be an indicator of the success of that nurse. But the nurse is incapable of finding out that kind of detail because it requires A, a longer time period, and B, a larger sample size. So mostly what I'm going to be talking about today is about evidence looking at outcomes based on surveys, either generalized surveys or very specific surveys. And again, I'll repeat that last point over and over again, right? It's use evidence to improve programs, scale what works, and to encourage innovation and test new approaches. The reason why we don't often use evidence and why it's actually hard to use evidence is because evidence is not neutral. Right? Evidence is actually quite value-laden. Right? It's like, whose evidence? Whose evidence counts? Right? I mean, I've got this quote there from an actual case study. The government official says, our new method of allocating resources is saving money and time, resulting in better alignments to budgets, better financial control, and fairer distribution of resources. The same process, the nurse says, the new method of allocating resources mean less resources when we need it, fewer resources to manage high demand times, and longer waiting times for patients. Same set of data. Right? Whose evidence counts? Whose evidence matters? Right? The premise of evidence-based policy and practice is that policy decisions should be unbiased and driven by community or country need rather than a desire of winning the backing of voters. Right? And I think that that's an important thing to mention. Right? There is a difference between the needs of the electorate, the needs of the community, the needs of the society, and the needs of a party that's trying to contest elections. There may be an alignment or there may not be an alignment. And I'll give you a couple of examples where there may actually be a misalignment. Just this year says, pillar A is a clear choice, but says not so fast. We also have to take into account my extensive marketing experience, selectively ignoring data like this. We have inbuilt biases. And I think being aware of our own cognitive biases is a good start of becoming good public service managers. A couple of examples from the whose evidence matters. So we did a lot of research to find out whether the social relief of distress grant made a difference or makes a difference. Now, the social relief of distress grant has multiple objectives. It doesn't have a single objective, right? One of the objectives was a hypothesis that it provides people who are unemployed with the money to overcome the costs of job search. The costs of job search in South Africa are quite high because people live far from places of work. So the costs of job search include the taxi fare, maybe a sandwich during the day. The costs of job search may be typing up a CV, posting it, getting it to people. The costs of job search in South Africa are much higher than in other countries because of the geographic nature of apartheid and apartheid spatial planning. So the hypothesis is that the social relief of distress will encourage people to go and look for a job and provide the financial means to go and look for a job. Right? So job seekers face a very high search cost. The grant was essentially designed to support job search. But here's the thing. I don't know if you know how the unemployment rate is measured. They go to a house and they say, are you working? Yes, I'm working, or no, I'm not. If I say, no, I'm not, they say, were you actively seeking a job in the last month? If you say yes, you are counted as unemployed. If you say no, you are not counted as unemployed. So this 28% of people, those are people who have answered yes to, I was actively seeking employment. So do you see how the SRD might push out the unemployment rate? Now, that's not a bad thing, but it might actually push up the unemployment rate. So how you use data and evidence and interpret the evidence is critical to an understanding of the design of policies and programs. Right? What the UCT academics at SALDRU say is that actually there is very little evidence that the social relief of distress grant has encouraged job search. It has had some other positive benefits. It has had a nutrition benefit. It also appears to have had some positive benefit on school attendance in the household. Both of those are very positive, but those were not what the policy was designed to do. Right? So if you want a policy that encourages school attendance or looking at household nutrition, you may not have designed the SRD. You may have designed it differently. Right? And so when you advise politicians on whether to carry on with the SRD or not, those sorts of issues have to be taken into account. So evidence is not neutral. It's value-laden. As a public servant, your job is to look at it in an unbiased way. Here's another one of these cartoons I like. While doing the research, keep in mind that there are only two types of facts: those that support my position and inconclusive. The presentation. Do you mind just okay? So let's come to I think the second last of the theoretical concepts. Everybody would agree with Roosevelt's assertion, right? So why is there actually so little experimentation? And there's some good reason why there's so little experimentation. The first is that there are thousands of possible ideas, right? Everybody has got an idea. Everybody has probably got 10 ideas. It's like everybody can tell you what the Bafana Bafana lineup should be if they're playing Nigeria, and everybody can tell you what the formation is. Everybody has got their own idea of what to do about how to improve educational outcomes. And you can't practically test everything, right? You can't. It's physically impossible. You don't have the time, you don't have the effort, you don't have the resources. We also have these inbuilt biases against, well, I know that's not going to work. Now that may be true. Or actually that's been tried somewhere else, but it hasn't worked. But you've got to be reasonably knowledgeable to be able to make those kinds of calls, to be able to narrow down into what a set of experiments can be possible and should be experimented upon. There's also what's called the piloting bias. And I'll give you two practical examples. When Sean Phillips was the head of the Department of Roads in Limpopo, he's now the DG of Water Affairs, I think, right? So Sean Phillips was a bit of a zealot. Sean Phillips had this view that you can build rural roads, sand roads, for cheaper price and shorter time with using people with hand shovels than machines. Right? It was something that was quite counterintuitive. Sean felt he believed it. So his MEC gave him the license to experiment. And he experimented with 7 or 8 different contracts, different models. What type of machinery? Is it just shovels? Or can I have a small machine? What type of management do I manage these people? And in over 5 or 6 years, over 30 or 40 different rural road contracts, he brought those costs down, to the point where he was successful in building rural roads with people, using 4 or 5 times more people for lower budget, better time than the machines. Right? We then said, okay, this is wonderful. Let's expand this. So the KZN guys were the first to say, we want to do the same thing. This is a great idea. We're going to use this model. We're going to build rural roads. And they started with fairly high cost structure. It came down a bit, but it did not come down further. It stayed high, right? We have had similar examples with both working for water and working on fire. where the constraint was the manager of the project. You required an extremely experienced manager to manage a road construction project to make sure that the quality, the cost, and the time is lower or better using hand. It took years to train such an engineer, and those engineers didn't exist in the public service. To put it differently, at the time, there was only one Sean Phillips, and he may have had 8 or 10 project managers, but he didn't have 50. And so any attempt to massify, scale up this program failed to achieve the requisite cost savings because there was a constraint. Now, you often have that when you pilot a project. When you pilot a project, you have very special circumstances, you throw a lot of resources into it, you identify the learnings, and then you're incapable of scaling it up because the piloting circumstances were so peculiar. But piloting is important. Piloting is essential. Proof is essential, right? That's the essential basis. I'll give you an example about in the US at the moment. So the Los Angeles Police Department developed this thing where about 12 people a year die in accidents in Los Angeles in police car chases. Right? So the police are chasing somebody, either the car in front or the police car knocks somebody, or accidentally somebody doesn't see the police car, and about 12 people die. So they developed this thing where it's a dart with a GPS tracker. So at the start of the car chase, you shoot this dart onto the back of the car. Then you don't need a high-speed car chase, right? You've got the machinery, the equipment to be able to track where this car goes, unless they stop and take off the dart if they've noticed that it's on, right? So this thing really worked. The problem was that it was quite easy to shoot a dart at a car. But the actual equipment to be able to track it in the police car was so expensive that it was not possible to scale up. Right? So here's a really good idea. Piloting worked, not able to scale up. Right? I can give you another half a dozen examples. The military skills development program, where they take on 3,000 people every year. Again, really good pilot, not able to scale up. Because there are actually only a certain number of highly experienced defense people who can train these youngsters. That's the constraint. So identifying the critical constraint is important, but it doesn't mean that piloting is wrong. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't pilot. But you should accept that while piloting is absolutely essential, in scaling up, you might not succeed if you aren't able to bridge the critical obstacle required for scale. But I'm surprised at how little regional and provincial diversity we have in South African public policy. Right? So I spoke to a woman who was a district head of education in Gauteng. So I say, you roll all of these programs out. Do you give any discretion to the schools? She says, no, these are the forms. This is what the head office wants from me. So I said, well, why don't you give them a little bit of discretion? So let's say one school wants to do it this way, another school wants to do it that way. Let them do it differently. Surely you're not concerned with the nature of the input and how the input is used. You're concerned about learner outcomes. No, but as the head of the school district, I'm held accountable for the returns. I'm held accountable for how the inputs are used. I'm not held accountable for the outputs, actually. The schools are held accountable for the outputs. So there's no license to experiment. There's no license to say, you try that. We'll see in a year or two whether it works or not. Right? Now, I accept that in public policy, there are some cases where you can't do that, where it's risky to do that. But I'm amazed at how little it's done in the public sector in South Africa. I'll just throw another difficult issue in and leave it hanging, and we can come back to it later. What's the difference between people or institutions? So there's two quotes. 2 or 3 honest, skilled, and experienced public servants can make a huge difference to outcomes through hard work, tenacity, and commitment. Well, I'm sure we've all come across those kinds of people. They can change the world. You put 3 or 4 of them together, they can change the world. They can do wonders, right? But the bottom statement, strong institutions can deliver wonders over time, irrespective of which incumbent is there, due to a culture of excellence, hard work, and collaboration. What is the difference between A and B? Surely we want good, smart, hardworking, innovative, agile people in public service, but we want to build strong institutions, right? Now, there's no right or wrong here. In an ideal world, you want both. But even in a place like the Treasury, I was struck by how quickly they could break the Treasury when they changed the leadership of the Treasury. Even in an institution that's strong, right? You know, in the ANC, there's a quote that sounds a little bit better in the Nguni languages. They say, you know, you don't hunt with other people's dogs. So the new minister comes, the new MEC comes, they change everybody. Why? I don't hunt with other people's dogs. You just break the institution. Even if a good person comes in, they just change everybody. A bad person comes in, they change everybody. Don't hunt with other people's dogs. Right? That's not conducive to institution building. I put this thing about here about focusing on outputs and outcomes. And, you know, you guys are senior public servants. I won't spend too long on this. But the cartoon I used for this is, you know, in India, India was one of the largest producers of cotton in the world. And the English came and they took all the raw cotton, they shipped it back to England, they made the fabric, and then they shipped it back to India and sold it, right? And that was the business model of colonialism. You take your raw materials, you break the local capacity, you add the value in the home country, and then you sell it back to the natives, right? That was colonialism. So Gandhi had this idea that we're going to spin our own cloth. We're not going to buy British cloth. So this is a cartoon that says, "Dear Mr. Gandhi, we regret we cannot find your proposal because the link between spinning cloth and the fall of the British Empire was not clear to us." An input, the people, processes, materials. An output is what you buy with the service. But an outcome is the end impact on the population. There is a clear link between the inputs and the outputs, but there isn't always a clear link between the outputs and the outcomes. There isn't. And this is where evidence comes into play, not an M&E approach. This is where evidence comes into play. Right? Most of our legal and regulatory regime focuses on how we account for using inputs. Government managers want to focus on outputs, and let's understand. But the public don't care about outputs. The public don't care about number of clinic visits. Public don't care about how many textbooks you delivered. Public want to know whether the children can read and write better, whether the people are getting better quicker. And it isn't always a straight line. Right? I'll use the police as an example. Right? We hold the police accountable for the level of crime. But we also know that the police are not solely responsible for the level of crime. Societal issues, the state of the economy, drugs, alcohol, broken families, all affect the level of crime. We also know that to really impact on crime, you need cooperation between the police, the prosecutor, the court system, with social workers, communities. You need all of that. Right? So what do you hold the police accountable for? Now, in South Africa, we've adopted the view that we hold the police accountable for nothing because it's too difficult. The fact that we spend 190 billion rand a year on policing is just soma, right? We hold them accountable for nothing because it's just too difficult, right? So they release the crime stats every year. There's no sense that, hang on a minute, things are getting worse. Why? Things are getting better. Why? Who have you fired? Who have you hired? Nothing like that, right? Now, I'm not pretending that these things are easy, because I went onto the website and I looked at about 10 or 15 different police departments, and I attempted to see what performance measures they use to hold the police department accountable. So response times are one. That almost every one of these 15 that I saw online in both advanced and developing countries, response times was a key indicator of police performance. Because it doesn't depend whether there's a history of violence, it doesn't depend whether there's high drug rates, but of course it does depend on whether you have a fuel, vehicles, how many vehicles you have, the spatial layout of squatter camps, all those do influence it, right? The number of arrests is often a key indicator. But if you focus on the number of arrests, you have police departments, and we've seen this in other countries, arresting a lot of innocent people, right? Or a lot of people for low priority crime. Now, let me give you the stats in South Africa. South Africa has 179,000 people in prison. By per capita population, we have the third or fourth highest prison population in the world. We have the lowest number of violent criminals in our prison compared to almost any country in the world. The lowest number of violent criminals. We are one of the most violent societies in the world. We have 17,000 murders a year. The US is at 40,000 with 6 times the population. Mexico, with 105 million people, has got about 20,000 murders a year. We got 17,000 murders a year with half the Mexico's population. And we have the fewest number of violent criminals in prison. And we have the highest prison population in the world. Because our police department is incentivized to catch people for non-violent crimes, easy to convict them, lock them up, and they look good. It has no real impact on the level of crime. Right? If you say, I'm going to hold the police department accountable for convictions, right? The thing is, the police then only arrest you if there's a watertight case. They don't arrest you if it's a little bit of a hard case, because conviction rates are what you're going to hold me accountable for. So you can't use that, right? There are a range of other such indicators where there is no evidence that the achievement of this indicator will contribute to that outcome. Or if there is, it's possible that it causes unintended consequences in the design of policy. Let me skip that. So let me go on. I was hoping to use 2 or 3 case studies, but I'm already running out of time. I won't give you the long policy background. I assume everybody in South Africa is broadly familiar with the long policy background, right? But learning outcomes diverge across schooling types. We had and still have only one external independent gauge of learner outcomes, the matric exams. So the argument is that we need more external assessments of learner performance more regularly to make interventions earlier if needed. The counter argument, there's lots of counter arguments to standardized tests. But given the language issues in South Africa, it is impossible to design a reading test that is absolutely equal across all 11 languages, right? But actually, what you don't want to do is encourage teachers to teach to the test. My kids go to a very nice private school. I can assure you there's a lot of teaching to the test. There's a lot of time spent teaching to the test. Their job is to make sure that your child gets an A at the end of the year. Their job is not to make sure your child learns anything. So if you have too much focus on testing, you get that problem, right? The teachers were concerned that this was the thin end of the wedge to performance pay for teachers. Now, you can't have performance pay for teachers. As much as you must hold people accountable, if you are teaching in a township environment compared to a former Model C environment, the inputs are so different. The amount of time that parents spend with children is so different. You can't say I'm going to pay the teacher in the former Model C school more because they're getting higher marks. But that doesn't mean that you can't use results to hold people accountable. So in around 2008-9, a group of people at Stellenbosch did some quite detailed research into this relationship between how marks change over time. What they found was that if you look at almost any school report in any setting in South Africa, the kids are averaging in the 60s. Whether it's the former Model C school, the top private school, or the township school, the worst performing school, the reports say the kids are averaging in the 60s. You then get to matric, and the kid gets 40 or 30, right? Because those tests were not independent, they were not an accurate reflection of learner scores. Now, if my child comes home with 60, I say, well done, go out and play soccer. If my child comes home with 40, I give him a clap on the head and say, sit down and read, right? So for 11 years, the children of township children are getting poor information about the performance of their children. Inaccurate information, right? So the entire schooling system is flying blind. So in 2009, when Minister Chabane, sorry about the apostrophe, Minister Chabane was the Minister of Performance Monitoring and Evaluation, we took this to him. We took the idea of a standardized test, the ANAs, right? Grades 3, 6, and 9. Now, this had been rejected by 2 previous presidents, by 2 previous ministers of education. Minister Chabane took the data to President Zuma at the time, and President Zuma agreed we should do this. And he knew that the biggest obstacle was going to be SADTU, right? In my view, the biggest counter-revolutionary movement in the country. Not for quoting. So in mid-2010, we introduced the ANAs and we staggered it. First grade 3, then grade 3 and 6, and then grade 3 and 6 and 9. And the results were absolutely staggering. Not just because we saw an improvement in marks, but because parents, for the first time, were given accurate information about the performance of their children. Schools could actually see how their school was performing at the national level. Schools then had to come up with a whole school improvement program. They had to involve the community, the shops, the parents, and you actually saw an improvement in results. 6 years later, SADTU called on their members not to administer the test. A year later, the ANAs were officially scrapped. Today, we have no idea whether schools are performing well or not. We have 20,000 primary schools, about 6,000 high schools. For at least the 20,000 primary schools, we have no clue. But it's okay, they're only township kids, they don't really matter, right? That's the approach that we've adopted. So I like my cartoon here. I'll let you read it in time. So what were some of the lessons learned from the ANAs? The first is that good evidence, well presented, can make a huge difference in winning an argument. So when those ideas were presented to Minister Pandor when she was in education, or President Mbeki, we didn't have the evidence. We just had the hypothesis. 2009, we had the data and the evidence. And we were able to persuade first Minister Chabane and then President Zuma because the evidence was so strong. Right? Research must focus on the relationship between outputs and outcomes. And policy must focus on the processes used to achieve certain outcomes. So what is it that those, how do you change your processes to achieve different outcomes? Good policy design must be consultative and collaborative. You have to consult with the unions. You have to give them certain assurances and guarantees. these things, what you end up implementing may not be perfect, but there has to be a process of consultation, of collaboration. Ultimately, government must lead, but you have to bring in stakeholders, and you have to insulate the public servant and the policy process from vote-catching politicians. I've put here just a couple of issues around COVID-19 and how COVID-19 is one case where there was a huge collaboration between the scientists and government. Right? And it's actually, in many ways, across the world, a very successful example of collaboration between scientists and government. We didn't always get it right. Government didn't always get it right. Banning open-toe shoes and cooked chicken was about as stupid as it gets. Right? But there was a genuine attempt to understand the science and to try and do the right thing. But the data was changing and changing rapidly. Right? You know, do you protect the most vulnerable citizens, or do you let the virus run its course to achieve herd immunity? There was this debate. Over 60s were vulnerable, under 60s were far less so. But do you try and limit infections, or do you let this thing develop herd immunity? No right or wrong. Right? You know, the issues around the effectiveness and feasibility of testing and tracing systems. I don't know if you remember those apps that we all downloaded and those track and trace. Right? Now, in some countries it worked. They had huge resources. In some countries it didn't. Right? Distancing rules. I mean, today with what we know about the virus, it made no sense not to allow the children to go to play sport. Right? Because there's no evidence that you're going to get the virus playing outdoors. Right? In fact, I think it's about 3 or 4% of all infections take place outdoors, like 97% of infections take place indoors. So, you know, all of those gatherings that we did, but again, we didn't know all the information. So new data was coming out all the time. The prevailing mistrust between government and the research community. Now, here's an interesting issue because it is not peculiar to South Africa, but it is particularly bad in South Africa. The experience on the HIV/AIDS issues means that there is perpetual mistrust between the scientists and government, especially in the health sector. Right? Now, here you're trying to collaborate in a different environment on a different issue, but that mistrust that was created earlier is important. Scientists always attach probabilities to scenarios. Policymakers don't know how to deal with probabilistic scenarios. So I'll give you a different example. There's an election on the 29th of May. The financial markets are saying that there is a 90% probability that the rand is going to strengthen by between 10 and 20% after the elections. But if that was true, the rand would strengthen today. But there's a 10% probability that the rand is going to weaken by 30% in the 2 weeks after the election. So they're giving you two scenarios. A, the rand's going to strengthen by 10%. B, the rand's going to weaken by 30%. And they're saying there's a 90% probability of scenario A, 10% probability of scenario B. So nobody in the market is prepared to take a bet because it's too risky. So the rand remains relatively undervalued, quite unchanged, but relatively undervalued. Because even the markets are not able to deal with these hugely divergent probabilistic scenarios. And here you can't experiment. Right? You can't say this province is going to do this one's going to do that. Scientists are often not held accountable for their advice. I'd only make the point that policymakers are told to use scientific evidence, but scientists avoid accountability, and that's part of the issue. Watch what's happening globally. I don't want to read all of this. You can read it, but there was a very big study into 4 countries looking specifically at the relationship between scientific advice and government action. And just, I'll read three sentences. The role of scientific advice changes in the course of the pandemic. So it was A in the first instance and B in the second instance. Right? The big issue in the pandemic, which scientists are often not able to is that to protect lives, you would recommend X. But X had a big economic impact on jobs. If you say, just do this because it will be better for jobs, then you might kill 300,000 more people. Those are very difficult choices. And scientists are not best placed to deal with those things, right? On this slide, I just want to outline this one thing here. When I worked at the Treasury, so I started my job at the Treasury as the education budget analyst, and my second job was public sector personnel policy, right? But up until today, 25 years after I left that, and after I joined the SARB, I'm invited to an annual forum at Stellenbosch University where all the researchers in the social sciences get together, and some government officials attend, but many don't. And they give presentations on, I am doing research on X. And it's just 3 days where everybody comes there, they talk for 10 minutes, I'm doing research on X. So the academic stands up, I'm doing my PhD on whether youth employment incentives work or not. Right? I'm doing my PhD on whether social workers at the school level has an impact on drug abuse in the school. I'm doing my PhD on this. And I've attended, even 25 years after I was not the education budget analyst, because of the rich discussions, the rich data set, just to see what people are talking about. Right? What types of public works programs work, what types of don't. There are researchers doing that. Now, I'm sure there's not just Stellenbosch, you can actually set it up elsewhere as well. But the relationship between the research community and the policymaker is an absolutely critical one. I don't think there's any time in my career where I was not on a weekly basis talking to people in the market or in academia or in other departments. What's the evidence telling you? What's the data telling you? Right? And here I got into big trouble because I was doing an induction for the SARB. And I told people that if you come and work here and you don't spend 5 hours a week reading the newspapers or journalists, please leave the door now, because you're not good enough to work here. I won't have to say this here because I assume you guys do twice that much. So just to conclude, there has to be a mindset that says, I want to seek out what works. There has to be a mindset that says, I don't know everything, I don't know what works. Put away your biases, look at the evidence objectively, engage robustly with the research community, but noting that they also have their biases. Right? They also come with values and ideology. There's always someone out there, someone who has done this stuff before. When African Bank collapsed in 2014, we did the second only bail-in in the world. Everybody thinks it was the first. Bail-in is where, for the first time, you forced not just the shareholders, but the creditors, the bondholders, to take a haircut on their investment in the bank. And we forced, so the public sector didn't pay a cent to bail out African Bank. In every other country in the world, when the banks failed in 2007-8, public money was used to bail out the banks. In South Africa, we made the shareholders and the bondholders, the asset managers who held debt of African Bank, we made them fund the bailout of African Bank. Everybody thinks it was the second, it was the first bail-in in the world. It wasn't, it was the second. Because it was done in Portugal a few years earlier, and all we had to do was know this, pick up the phone the Portuguese regulator, tell us what you did, and we copied them. But we had to have known that it was done because we read the newspapers daily. We're in touch with people. We're in touch with the academic literature on the issues, right? So even though it is often hailed as the most innovative banking intervention, we actually just copied somebody else. And there's nothing wrong with that. Right? There's somebody out there somewhere in the world who has the problem that you have. Let me stop there, and I know I've run over time.
Just speak out loud. Oh, thank you. Colleagues, may I ask us one more time to give a heartfelt applause for a very frank, conversational, rich, multi-dimensional presentation that's certainly pointed at various implications for inquiry, accountability, our values and interests, the outcomes we pursue, innovation paths we take. And I will stop here for now and request that by way of response, way of discussion, we open this dialogue further through 3 well-prepared presentations, thoughts, I would say on the spot, as a sample from various sectors, various spheres of government, various points of practice. Allow me, if you may come forward in the order as shown in our program. We'll start with Morena Nape Nchabeleng, after which automatically, Madam Nancy, you will follow, and we will then have Dr. Gunnar. So in that order, please, as our key respondents, I thank you.
Well, thanks, Program Director. And greetings to all, just to manage time. The presentation is indeed very thought-provoking and appropriate if we really take into cognizance the context within which we find ourselves in as a country. And I believe that we do have solid experience that as a country, of course, that we have acquired over time on issues related to planning and execution. And of course, what is emerging is to check or to make an assessment on whether the interface between the two is indeed based on evidence. And I would like to argue that since 1994 to date, in our efforts to build a democratic state, we do have some kind of a mixed experience on this strategic question. We have adopted a series of plans over time. Perhaps we can even start with the first version of Reconstruction and Development Plan, which was very clear on the key strategic outcomes that should guide the mandate of a democratic state. And then equally so, we have adopted series of programs at high level, including adopting medium-term strategic framework after each and every elections, then in a sense, evidence is there, or data is there to guide on whether we are on the right track or not. But what is interesting, as the presenter has earlier indicated, that one of the key imperatives to assess on whether our planning and execution at value is to use outcomes as a basis of assessment. But as we speak today, the country is generally accepting that we are going through a poly crisis across various sectors of society, notwithstanding the fact that the plans are there, we've been implementing programs. Hence, I'm saying that perhaps this discussion can actually serve as a catalyst to reflect amongst those issues, on those issues amongst others. And secondly, my limited experience in the public service tells me that we do have an embedded tendency to pilot, to adopt series of pilots, but equally so, we are unable to take lessons learned from such pilots and translate them into sustainability, or actually withdraw from those initiatives if they don't work, as the presenter has earlier alluded to. And this matter is very prevalent without excluding other sectors. It is very prevalent in our approach on local government. The colleagues that have got an experience in the local government sphere, either directly or indirectly, will tell you that often than not, every third year will come up with a new program without even analyzing whether the previous program was effective or not, and then make policy pronouncement on that. As we speak today, the country has adopted, and correctly so, the DDM approach. But what guarantee do we have that after the elections, that DDM approach is going to prevail? Because you will probably have a new leadership. And that leadership may simply say that, no, we are starting with this new one. And then I think that has been a trend over the last few years. Just to move towards a conclusion, because I only have a restricted time. One key issue that I would like to make a recommendation on is to check on to what extent do we have opportunities to build institutional capacity and capabilities in the state to advance evidence-based planning and execution agility. Because in my view, unless we anchor this approach around strengthening institutional capacity in the state, we will be tempted to actually continue the current pattern, whereby all our strategic planning documents in one or another have emphasized on creating sustainable jobs, creating inclusive economy with high growth trajectory and reducing inequality. But all the reports and the findings that are before us are actually indicating that we are regressing on all those strategic outcomes. But perhaps this approach of evidence-based planning and execution can help us to take stock and then shape the agenda for the next 10 years, bearing in mind that we are left with few years to reach the LDP targets. And then this period can actually help us to reinvigorate planning regime towards this direction. Otherwise, come 2030, we may reach a stage whereby all key strategic outcomes embedded in the National Development Plan will still be unattainable. And then on that basis, I would therefore appeal to the decision makers that we need to use the 7th term of administration to consolidate on that institutional capacity and capabilities, because through that mechanism, we may then be able to move forward. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Program Director, Professor, ladies and gentlemen, and our esteemed colleagues. Let me say all protocol observed in the interest of time. Thank you very much for the masterclass and the presentation by Mr. Naidu. Firstly, let me express our gratitude to you, sir, for this masterclass on the effective use of evidence for planning and executing diligence. The insights shared here today, this morning, have highlighted crucial facts. Without a strong foundation based on evidence, our efforts are more likely to be unsuccessful. Indeed, while the primacy of evidence in decision-making has long been accepted, practitioners are often more inclined to rely on other knowledge systems, such as personal experience, prior practices, training, own opinions, and prejudice, which poses a serious and a huge risk. You said in your presentation, we don't have to trust our guts when it comes to planning. Therefore, at the core of evidence planning is use of data that meets the following criteria: internal validity, external validity, reliability, adequacy of reporting. In other words, statistics adequate and data support finding, which means the latest data is the one that is critical. In the recently published the Government Analytic Handbook, the World Bank states that government are data rich, yet their wealth of information remains largely untapped due to a lack of systematic practice to harness this data to make public administration work better. This means government, as public servants, we are missing out on data insights that can enhance our work. How can government leverage this wealth of information to enhance public administration efficiency? There's a need to build expertise to harness vast amounts of this data, translating it into actionable insight for smarter decision-making and policy development. One of the mandates of the PSC is to monitor and evaluate public admin practices, which is dependent on the use of data to provide valuable insight into the progress, challenges, and outcomes of various initiatives. By using data-driven approaches, departments can rigorously assess the effectiveness of their programs, identify areas for improvement, and make informed decisions to optimize resources allocation and enhance impact. Thus, data-driven methodologies also foster a culture of transparency, accountability, innovation, and continuous improvement. Program Director, I would like to make the following observation based on the presentation we just heard this morning. As we wrap up the 6th administration and prepare for the 7th one, public which enshrines the constitutional values and principles. The Constitution stipulates that public administration must be governed by democratic values and principles. And one of the principles states that public admin must be responsive and citizens must be encouraged to participate in policy making processes. On the matter of value-laden evidence, as alluded to by Mr. Naidu, as the PSC, we are of the view that the Section 195 principle of the Constitution that I've already mentioned, where we encourage the public to participate in policymaking and also to make sure that there's impartiality, there's fairness, equity, and biasness. This will enhance the use of evidence in citizen-centric policymaking. On the outcomes, on the outputs and outcomes, we are of the view as the PSC that both are important. However, we have noted that by design, departments are not geared to driving interdepartmental and intersectoral outcomes. One of the biggest culprits being the annual planning framework and accountability structures. We need program redesign to be linked more directly to outcomes across sectors. We have also noted, Mr. Naidu, that we are still working in silos as departments. My colleague here alluded to the DDM, which is a model that is being used by local government. There is thus an urgent need, ladies and gentlemen, for continuous collaboration, integration, synchronization of our plans. We cannot afford to continue planning in silos like we are doing. On the matter of holding the police accountable, lower levels of accountability is a byproduct of attribution. To resolve that, there must be two types of indicators. One that is attributable to a single player and one that joins all the players at an outcome level. For this to happen, it requires co-planning by departments and the use of evidence. We cannot hold police accountable, Mr. Naidu, for service delivery protests relating to water, electricity, but we need to hold those municipalities at the coalface of service delivery accountable. On the case of COVID makes for an interesting observation on the dichotomy of scientific evidence and political decision-making, especially when we traverse uncharted waters. In the event of providing evidence in the context of uncertainty, parties must remain in their professional sphere. What we are saying here as the PSC is that there should be clear delineation of responsibilities. Based on the insight presented, senior bureaucrats must recognize the success cases showcased today on the effective use of evidence for planning and executing diligence as more than just isolated stories. Instead, they should be seen as compelling challenges that demand further exploration, analysis, and replication. These achievements serve as a powerful demonstration of the transformative potential of the evidence-based methodologies when applied with careful consideration. Program director, is also important to recognize that success stories can be both inspiring and challenging. As senior bureaucrats, we have a responsibility to thoroughly examine these cases and identify the strategies and principles that led to their success. We should always be on the lookout for new research, be open to new methods. I think I'm schooled this morning to say I must admit, I must accept that I don't know everything. So I must be open to new methods and consider innovative approaches that can help us make better decisions. In closing, let us heed the call to action embedded within the success stories on the effective use of evidence we have encountered or we've learned this morning. Let us embrace evidence as the cornerstone of our planning and execution diligence. And we will never go wrong, recognizing that is not merely a tool, but a guiding principle that can steer us towards greater efficiency, effectiveness, and ultimately success. Together, let us embark on a journey of service excellence and continuous improvement, and are guided by the evidence-based approach that we have been inducted into this morning. In making decisions, we need to understand what works as a way of making better, more effective decisions. My professor used to say, education implies a change in behavior. So if you have learned something, we will see by a change in the manner in which we plan. Thank you very much.
Okay, Program Director, ladies and gentlemen, all protocol observed. Thanks, Kuben, for such a provocation. I guess when we retire, some of us like you will be able to reflect as you have done. Now, very quickly on some of the issues that have come up, I will start with the issue around ideology and evidence. Because we all know that at some point, perhaps in the 1960s, there was a movement called deregulation, led by the Chicago School of Economics, Milton Friedman and others. But what we know now is that that did not happen. Ideology has remained. So attempt to think about everything without ideology has not worked. Not even in the United States of America, where the movement is started. So by this, I'm trying to underscore that we live in the reality of ideology, which is an expression of ideas by people. So human beings, by their very nature, have ideas, have beliefs that they represent. So the point here should not be about whether to choose ideology or evidence. It's not either or. As I've said, that attempts were made before to create that distinction, and we should not do that. The point is whether ideology and evidence can coexist. And I move from a view that they have to coexist. Because when you look at public policy is both inductive and deductive. And to a large extent, ideology can help to set outcomes, what a particular environment, nation, community aspire to achieve. So as you correctly say, that such choices are value-laden. So we need to appreciate that in the nature of things, ideology can assist. But what is very key is how to introduce evidence in an environment that is characterized by ideology as opposed to saying that we need to do away with a ideology. Now, what is critical in my view, and I will not repeat what colleagues have said, but I'll just pick on some of the kind of issues that we are dealing with currently in government. One of the things that we've been trying to do is to work on the institutional mechanism. All of you have referred to how we need to reorganize institutions to win. And what we have done recently is the professionalization of the public service, the amendments that we all know of to the Public Service Act and the Public Management Act. They seek to work on the institutions. As DG Limpopo correctly indicated that we can talk about evidence, but when the institutions are not organized to win, we are not going to achieve evidence. But let me say that where we are, when you compare to the East Asian model of institutions, we are in no way closer to what they did. They talk about embedded autonomous bureaucracy. That's not where we are. But we believe as government that the strides that we've made in the professionalization of the public service, in terms of the two amendments to the two pieces of legislation that I've referred to, will go a long way. Now, we have also learned from the current MTSF that at the start in 2019, the MTSF had about 500 and something targets. So I can safely say that we attempted to touch everything that exists, that matters in South Africa. We did that. The question is, if we did that, why did we fail? There is a CEO of Nokia who's always quoted saying something like, it's not like we didn't do we did everything, but we still didn't get it right. I think to a large extent, we are in the same situation that we thought about everything in the MTSF. We attempted to do everything in the MTSF, but we won in some areas and we didn't win in others. Now, there is a suggestion from colleagues at DPME that as we approach the next planning cycle in preparation for the next administration, we need to talk about evidence more and more. And one of the areas that concern us is about causal pathways. How do we make assumptions that if we do this, will lead to this and that and that and that and that? That work needs to be done. And those who have done the theory of change will now appreciate that without understanding the causal pathways, we are in no position to win as government. So that is going to be very key as we plan for the next administration, and that work is started. We also obviously need to strengthen the guidelines on the use of evidence so that all of us can be uniform. And I'm using guidelines advisedly so that we avoid being overly prescriptive. So that there is a lot of work that is being done in that regard. And then let me conclude by saying that we need to talk about artificial intelligence and how it can see innovation in public. We need to do that principle as a matter of great agency so that the public service should also lead in how artificial intelligence develops. I understand that when you go to ChatGPT or any other AI tool, it will give you information. Sometimes it will say, I don't know what you are asking me about. If you give me information, maybe I will learn and start to understand. So it means that if more people in the United States use artificial intelligence, every time we search, it will give us what it knows because of the users. So the more we as practitioners in the public space, in public policy, also take up artificial intelligence, we will then go a long way. So colleagues, with those few words, I'm emphasizing that there is work being done in government and there is more to be done. And Kuben will continue to engage with you after this as we plan for the next administration. Thank you.
We did. May we have one more heartfelt round of applause for our three respondents. Director General, Office of the Premier, Limpopo. Madam National Commissioner, Office of the Public Service Commission. Director General, Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation. So well placed here. Thank you for the reflections, the questioning, interrogation with that well-placed also sense of self-critique and pointing to what needs to be done, what needs to be strengthened. I've asked that our colleagues, for benefit of inclusivity, we then have a display, Mr. Naidu. Some of these are on the virtual platform, comments, others are questions. So this is now to open up before we come to the floor here. First take, if you may just have a look. I don't know if perhaps it's best for you to take notes from. Have a view of what is being said there. Are you able to display?
Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted the size to be larger. Just open the pop it out. Yes, thank you. Oh, it gets smaller. All right. Maybe. Yeah. They'll keep coming. So we just take notes without stopping.
Just while that's flashing up, just a couple of comments. You know, what I mean by ideology is not, I wouldn't ever ask somebody to leave your values behind. But what I mean by ideology is preconceived ideas about what works and what doesn't. And I think we can accept that those preconceived ideas sometimes do need to be left at the door. But of course, we're here because we have a particular set of values and ethos that you can't take away. Right? Just on this issue of accountability, you know, accountability is not about finding blame. Not about saying, oh, you know, there's a high crime rate, so who do I fire? That's not the purpose of accountability. Let me take 2 steps back about what I call the theory of the organization. Right? Every organization, whether you Standard Bank or you the Treasury or you the Reserve Bank or whether you Apple or you Google, you grow. Right? You add layers of bureaucracy. You add layers of people. You increase the size of your HR department and you increase the size of your tech department. Every organization. But where's the check? Now, in a market economy, Standard Bank is a huge bureaucracy. I tell Sim Shabalala, I say, Sim, you know, even if you wanted to change Standard Bank, you can't. It's a big, unwieldy bureaucracy. Right? It's not any less bureaucratic than any big government department. In fact, in many cases, it's more bureaucratic than many government departments. But there is some check. Either the people who hold their shares say, actually, no, this is too fat. I will sell them. Or if you as a customer feel you're not being given a good service, I'm going to go somewhere else. Right? So in a market economy, you do have some checks, natural built-in checks, that would attempt to constrain the degree to which Standard Bank can grow. It attempts to constrain the degree to how fancy their head offices are. And their head offices are very fancy. In public services, you often don't have that automatic check on the size and nature of the bureaucracy. There's no check. There's no shareholder that says you're a bit too fat. As long as you've gone by the book, the Auditor General is not going to say, this is a bit too unwieldy. The public, in many cases, can't say, you know what, I don't like the service here, I'm going next door. I stand in the queue at the Home Affairs office, I'm not happy with my service, I'll go next door. There's no next door. And so we have to be mindful of the fact that because there aren't automatic checks and balances, to constrain this natural urge for bureaucracy to expand, which exists in both the public and private sector, there has to be accountability mechanisms. We have to create those accountability mechanisms, as imperfect as they are. And it's not about attaching blame. It's not about saying, who do I fire, right? I mean, I've often said that if there's a new CEO of Transnet, I'm quite sure that things are going to be worse in 3 years' time, not better. But I wouldn't necessarily fire her for that. It might be because things are going down. It's going to take her 3 to 5 years to stabilize things and turn it around. Right? So if things go worse in 3 years' time, everybody says, no, fire her, fire her, fire her. That's not the purpose of accountability. But if after 5 years or 7 years or 10 years, things are still going down, then either you change the way you do things, which is often first prize, try to do things better, try to become more effective, or you have to then say, well, I need a different approach. And that might include getting different people, it might not. Often, what I found, I don't know if people don't mind raising their hands, how many people here have implemented major projects that have failed? I see one hand, 2 hands. Who here has implemented major projects that have failed? She's. I can talk about major projects that have failed for the next 5 hours that I've implemented. When COVID hit, we introduced this loan guarantee scheme. It didn't work. We spent months on it, hours, sweat, blood, tears, trying to introduce this loan guarantee scheme. It failed, didn't work. If you have not implemented a major project that had failed, you're probably not doing your job well enough. I'm serious. When we wanted to rebuild the payment system at the Reserve Bank, I called a guy by the name of Barry Ho. Logan will know Barry. So Barry used to be in Nedbank. He then worked at SARS for about 10 years. He then went and built Discovery Bank's new banking system. He's a techie. So I called Barry. I said, Barry, don't you want to come in and work for me? He says, why? I said, because you've implemented more failed IT projects than anybody else I know. That's why I want to hire you. Barry has implemented more failed IT projects than anybody I know. So I hired him. He's also implemented some successful ones, just for the record. The professionalization of the public service is absolutely critical. You're absolutely right. And I think that the legislative and other reforms that have been made recently around insulating the public service from excessive political interference are absolutely right. We have a flaw in our system that has been there for a long time, and we've known about it, but we have not done enough to fix it. This flaw is about the split in accountability between the Public Service Act and the PFMA. The PFMA says that the Director General is the accounting officer. The Director General is accountable for what happens. The Public Service Act says the minister is accountable for personnel appointments. There's a tension between this. When Robinson Ramaite and I appeared in the Portfolio Committee in Parliament, when the PFMA was going through 1999, 2000, Robinson was DG of GPSA. The MPs, they said, how are you going to fix this thing? The PFMA says the Accountant General, the Director General is accountable. The Public Service Act essentially says the people side of things is the Minister or the MEC. There's a split here. Who is accountable? We promised we'll fix it, we never fixed it. I think the latest attempts in terms of the amendments to the Public Service Act is an attempt to try and fix that problem. Right? And so I welcome this. There's a little fact I often like to throw in. Korea has had competency testing for the public service. For how long? Anybody want to guess? Any guesses? They've had competency testing. You don't pass the competency test, you can't get into the senior management service. How long have they had competency testing for? 730 years. 730 years they've had competency testing in their public service. Now, for most of that time, it was just by hearting Confucian texts. But it meant that even then, only the best and brightest got into the public service. For most of it, it was irrelevant tests that made no impact on your ability to be a public servant. In some ways, it was a weeding out thing. It may have even been quite elitist and a tool of class domination. But it did mean that only the best and brightest got into the public service, not just anybody. Right? If you don't have a merit-based public service at that level, of course, taking into account our transformation objectives, if there isn't a merit-based public service, having taken account of our transformation objectives, then you're not going to get the best and brightest in the public service, and you're not going to professionalize the public service, because it's just mediocrity wins. The last comment I'll make is on AI. Right? AI is one of those things that it's a bit like the internet. Nobody quite knows how it's going to change the world, but it is going to change the world. I don't know how. I don't know how you can make money out of it. Right? When ChatGPT came out, the advert was that this thing will get an A on a third-year essay, ChatGPT. So I went into ChatGPT and I put in there, what are the key financial stability risks facing South Africa? Right? And the answer I got was quite poor. This thing would not have got an A if I was the marker. I don't know about the marking standards at the NSG, but if I was the marker, this thing, ChatGPT wouldn't have got an A. ChatGPT probably would have got a B on a first-year essay, but not an A on a third-year essay. So every month for 14 months, I went in and I put into ChatGPT, what are the top financial stability risks facing South Africa? If I were to do that now, I would get an answer that would get an A on a master's test. In just 18 months, the technology has improved so much that this thing would have gone from a B or C at the third-year level to an A on a master's test. That's how good how fast the improvement in the technology is. Now, I'm not saying that this has replaced people, but I'm saying that there are very few people at the Reserve Bank that can write a better three-pager for me than ChatGPT. So what I often do now is people don't like to take minutes, right? It's like a terrible job. It's a bit boring. It's a bit grand. You say, okay, don't worry. Just record it, produce a transcript, chuck it into ChatGPT, ask ChatGPT to summarize it for you. The first 3 or 4 times you've got to do a little bit of work. It's not going to be perfect. Give it 6 months of doing the stuff, because remember, you're teaching the computer as well. Right? Now, 8 out of 10 times, I go to a meeting, I press the record button, I play dots, or I play my crossword puzzle. At the end of the day, I get a 10-minute summary of the meeting. Right? Highly accurate. Now, if you think that this is not going to change the way we work, if you think it's not going to change the way in which we will interface with the public, you know, again, I don't know how it's going to change, but it's going to hit us, and it's going to hit us hard. And we better understand the issues, understand the use of technology. Big data is what drives this. And you made the quote that the public service is data rich, right? Who's got better data? Who's got more data? I'll give you just to entertain you, I'll give you 2 or 3 pop examples. So in Kenya, you go, you apply for a loan, they ask you for consent to share your contacts on your phone. Right? They do 2 things with those contacts. The first thing that they figured out was that if you've got name and surname, you're 30% more likely to repay the loan than if you only got your first name. Right? 30% more likely to repay the loan. Then the second thing they did is they take everybody on your contacts database and they check the credit scores of everybody. It's all publicly available, right? I can go in, I can get your credit scores. Based on the credit scores of the people on your contacts, I give Pusani a credit score. I give him the interest rate that I'm going to charge him. Pusani is completely ignorant of everything that's happening behind the scene. He just ticked those 5 boxes at the bottom. Right? Yeah, sure, I'll give you a loan at prime +2. Oh, that's very good. Yeah, because you know a few ministers in your contacts, right? the ability for big data to change the way in which we deliver public services is phenomenal. Health is probably going to be the single biggest area, but it's also the single riskiest area. Right? Because 9 out of 10 times, the doctor comes and the doctor asks you certain questions. Right? The doctor asks you about your diet, asks you about aches and pains, asks you about how you're feeling, how you slept. The doctor may take your pulse. The doctor may take your blood pressure. Right? 92% of the time, the doctor then can diagnose what's wrong with you based on talking to you, taking your blood pressure, looking inside your ears, looking inside your throat. A computer can do all of that. All of that. But it doesn't mean you can get rid of the doctor. Right? But surely if you want to be able to deliver public services, you have to begin to think about these things. Right? And the use of technology in the delivery of public services, I think so, I think South Africa is significantly behind. We've made good progress in some areas, but we're significantly behind in that regard. Facial recognition technology, it's being used for, in some cases, intrusive, in some cases, security reasons. I think some countries have abused it. But the use of facial recognition in crime prevention, in access control, in all of those kinds of things. I mean, it hasn't quite been perfected, but you can phone your bank and you can tell your bank transfer 100 Rand to X to Y. The bank will know whether somebody is holding a gun to your head or not from the change in your voice. That's how good the technology is today. The bank can sense that this person has just said, pay 100 Rand to Pusani, but somebody on the other side of the line is holding a gun to his or her head. Because your voice changes when you're scared. Right? So a good fraud detection system can do that. Today, all the banks have got fraud detection systems that are not perfect. But damn, they're going to get much better in the next year or two. Right? I mean, and it's that 0.1 second, right, where the Pusani has given consent or he's gone onto his app and he said, transfer some money. The bank has got literally 0.1 second to know whether he's been kidnapped, he's been hijacked. This may be a legitimate transaction, it may not be. Why can't we think about those kinds of use cases in the public service? Yeah. So I'll stop there. I've taken more time. But are there specific questions that have come up?
I can just summarize a few, without restating the question, but it was issues of being risk averse in our approach in general versus this desire to instill a culture of experimentation, piloting, prototyping. There's also an issue of this ideology question, rather seeing it as an opportunity to declare our biases, declare our ideological stances, which is different from saying, I'm neutral, I do not have any ideology. The question of outputs, if they could be strengthened, if they could be directed towards strengthening evidence-based practices. Maybe I'm misrepresenting that one, but those were some of these, and others were comments, for example, along the lines of strengthening collaborations in the use of data research across all levels. May I speed up then maybe to hear directly from the floor? If there are questions, then you can take those.
You can take one if you're honest.
So, colleagues, you may direct these to Mr. Naidu, then we
Please
don't
call me
have,
Kuben.
thanks, Kuben, then we don't have the intermediary. So we note one on the side. Is there another hand beside? For Mike's sake, if you two here. So we know the protocol. You say who you are. and you direct your question. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. My name is Danny Ramkosi from the National Department of Transport. You raised two issues, the issue of ideology and the issue of the impact analysis. I think the question that I want to ask, why is impact analysis not being conducted in government as a whole? The main focus for the executive is just maybe input and so on, but the impact analysis is not conducted because in many cases, you find that people that are at a strategic level are not necessarily competent. Even the issue of performance target analysis and everything, they are conducted. But when you look at the formulation of the targets and performance indicators against the output, there is no correlation. It is then it's also linked to the issue of professionalism in the public service. There's no such thing called professionalism in public service. Because the recruitment has got a lot of red tape. There are positions that are reserved for certain people. If you are not affiliated to certain organization, you're out. So that's why nowadays now the main root cause, because people are not looking at the root cause. The root cause is with regard to the recruitment of the executive is politicized. There's no room for you. You can have IA, artificial intelligence, all those things. But remember, in public service, there's no room for innovation. You are not allowed to be innovative. If you start becoming innovative, then you are pinpointed as a troublemaker. There is no innovation. There's no room for innovation. That's why nowadays, the main focus is not impact analysis. That's why nowadays we focus more on the 7 administration and everything. But you are not given a report relating to the impact of what has been done the last 7 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I don't disagree with you. I think it's a cultural issue. I think organizational culture has to change, right? You know, when I joined the Treasury in 1995, I hated it. I said, geez, I hate this culture. I'm never going to survive more than 3 years here. I'll probably get fired, but let me give it a go. And I ended up spending 18 for 2 reasons. One is I thought that the leadership was committed to changing the culture. So I was part of that process because I think there was a leadership there that was committed to changing the culture. And we made significant cultural changes. When I joined the Reserve Bank, I only joined the Reserve Bank 11 years ago, not that long ago, so 2013. I didn't like the culture. 70% of senior managers were white male when I joined in 2013. 70%. Over 50 white men. When I joined the SARB, there were separate lifts for executives and other people. When I joined the SARB, there was an executive dining room. In fact, my letter offer said I have access to the executive dining room, only above a certain level. By the time I started on the first day, Joe Marcus had got rid of the executive dining room. Tito never changed that. Tito never changed his lift stuff. I joined the SARB, even though I didn't like the culture, because I was convinced that Lesetja was committed to changing the culture. Right? And I wanted to be part of that process. I wanted to be part of the journey of changing the culture of the organization. And I can tell you he's done a fantastic job of changing the culture. Not just the demographics, the culture and the excellence has gone up. The culture has gone better. Not only does the organization hit its employment equity targets, but the performance of the organization has gone up. And the culture is very different. There's no executive lifts, there's no executive dining room. There's 2 canteens, one where you pay 15 Rand for the meal, one where you pay 60 Rand for the meal. Anybody can go anywhere. Your choice. Right? And it's not that expensive, even the other one. But just those little symbols were changed. Innovation, if you're innovative, you're a troublemaker. geez, if you try to recruit people and they know that if you're being innovative, you're a troublemaker, then you will not attract good people. Yeah. Sorry.
Thank you. Okay. Is it working? Yeah, I think it's working. Good morning. Thank you for the discussion more than anything else. My name's TK Power from the Wits School of Governance. And I think your talk also does have repercussions, I think, for even institutions of higher learning. Because I used to think that, universities were a bit different to government, but we're just a bit different. We have more fancier titles than government. But my question goes back to the relationship you point out between evidence and experimentation. Just to maybe go back a bit in wording, my understanding of experimentation presupposes that there's a hypothesis that you're trying to test out. Now, what I quite don't get about the South African, and I say state, meaning government in this instance, is what is the question the South African government is trying to figure out? Because this really does, I think it's one key research focus. We've had 3 decades now, which represents a whole generational change. You've spoken about the many different dynamics that happen every 5 years, and I think the subsequent input has also said the same thing. But it seems like we know what's going to happen, but what I've never got, what is the question? And but by way of example, if you go back to China, 1872, Qing general by the name of Li Hongzhang, understanding that the Qing Empire was crumbling, the colonialists were coming in, and China was changing. He kind of hypothesized that, listen, the big thing China needs to sort out going forward is about self-determination and modernization. Jump forward, Singapore, obviously Malaysia doesn't want to take them in. Their big question of the day is, how do we get a global foothold? Because we know we're too small to simply just exist in this thing. What I've never understood about the South African government is, what are we trying to figure out? Now, people point me to the constitution, but again, that presupposes that this is a great constitution. So again, what is the question this state is trying to figure out? And maybe if, like, we were to take what you've put forward, is we really were searching for an answer or question, we should also be open to questioning the constitution and saying, listen, how do we have a 3-tier system of government for only 65 or 62 million people? Understanding that the province was not really a issue of evidence, it was determination of the time. Yeah, so my issue is, what is the government's question that we've been trying to answer?
I don't think there's a single question. I think there are multiple questions. I mean, one of the things that when in the National Development Plan, which I didn't write, it was written by the Commission, I just led the Secretariat. I just gave them an office, got them to write, did a bit of editing. They wrote the plan. But we did a lot of thinking about how come inequality went up post-apartheid. When we completely changed the government, we had 17 education departments, we merged it into one, we introduced social grants, we introduced a child support grant. It was only in 1992 that the pensions of Black and white people were equalized. We introduced free basic electricity, free basic water. We introduced a housing program. Despite all of this, inequality went up. Why? How come? The Thomas Piketty view of the world, I don't know if you've read the book Capital. The Thomas Piketty view of the world was that inequality has gone up in the world because of an increase in returns to capital. So the relative returns to labor has gone down and the relative returns to capital has gone up. What I mean by that is that as a worker, my earnings are going to grow by 8 or 10% a year. But if I take my earnings and I put it in the stock market, it's going to grow by 10 or 12% a year. So as a person who owns shares, capital, you are going to become richer over time than me as the worker. So that was the prevailing view on why inequality went up since '94. Not a South African phenomenon, a global phenomenon. It's gone up in almost every place in the world. Not every place, but almost every place. So we did a series of research papers, focus groups, conferences, And actually, we came to a conclusion that that is not the reason why inequality has gone up in South Africa. Right? Our starting hypothesis was that inequality had gone up because the returns to capital had gone up. But actually, that is not the reason why inequality had gone up in South Africa. Inequality had gone up because the returns to education had gone up. Now, what I mean by the returns to education is there's something called a returns to skills curve. If I've got 3 years of schooling, I earn X. If I've got 5 years of schooling, I earn X plus something. If I've got matric, I earn Y. If I've got a 3-year degree, I earn Z. If I've got a 4-year degree, I earn this. There's a curve. And you can plot this curve for every country in the world. And the curve looks something like this, right? The more educated you are, the more you earn. But the curve in South Africa after 94 shifted like that. It got steeper. The relative earnings for low-skilled people fell. The relative earnings for high-skilled people went up. Why is this? We were baffled. We were puzzled. Our general hypothesis was completely wrong. We assumed that if you've got a house in a wealthy area that's worth 2 million rand, the value of your house is going up at a faster rate than somebody who doesn't have a house but who has a job. Actually, that wasn't the case. The evidence suggested that the reason why the rich were getting richer is because they were more skilled. Right? The returns to skills curve shifted up after 94. Why did it shift up? And why did it shift up so much more than in other countries? In South Africa, there were at least 4 or 5 reasons. I'll just give you 3 or 4. The one is between 1970 and 1995, we lost about half of our agricultural jobs. And again, that's not a uniquely South African phenomenon, but we lost about half of our agricultural jobs between 1970 and 1995. Agriculture was the single largest employer of low-skilled labor. Between 1990 and 2010, we'd lost half our mine worker jobs, both because we've run out of gold, because we've mechanized, because there's less investment in mining. Mining is more mechanical today. But we've lost half our mine workers' jobs. Mining was the second largest employer of low-skilled people. The only low-skilled sector that was growing was the security industry. So the private security sector went from 300,000 to 1 million in the period 1990 to 2010. But it was insufficient to absorb the numbers of low-skilled jobs that we were losing in other sectors. At the same time that that was happening, high-skilled sectors were growing rapidly. The public service was a high-skilled sector. Over 2/3 of people who work in the public service have a university degree. Like 75% of all Black African people with a degree are employed by the state, not the private sector. Right? So the state itself was pushing up the costs of skilled labor. The banking sector, the financial sector, the tech sector have all done phenomenally well since 94. They're all high specialist, high tech, high paying sectors. And so in part because of white immigration and skills shortages at the top, skilled people were demanding a huge premium on their salaries and pushing up this curve on that side. Now, it just so happened that things have changed a bit, but the vast majority of high-skilled people were white. So there was no difference in the racial composition of inequality, but there was a fundamental difference in the driver of inequality. It did mean that you can't reduce inequality by giving poor people assets, but you can reduce inequality by giving them education. Right? Now, those were major assumptions we made. And I think that the NDP attempted to rebalance the policy discourse in South Africa away from giving people assets to try to give people capabilities. not just skills, but other types of capabilities, public transport, cleaner environment, etc. Frankly, most people in government have never read the NDP. Frankly, most people in government just paid lip service to it, and it was never implemented. Every time Zuma spoke, he trumpeted the NDP. He had no intention of implementing it. The most interesting chapter in the NDP is the chapter that deals with accountability in the state-owned enterprises. And it deals with a hypothetical story, but I will call it the Jacob Moroka problem. Jacob Moroka was the CEO of Eskom. Who was Jacob Moroka accountable to? So the way in which he was appointed was that there was a discussion in Luthuli House, there were 2 or 3 names, and he emerged at the top of the name. The minister responsible for public enterprises went to Luthuli House with a different name. He or she was persuaded to change the name. The board then get told who is the minister's preferred name. The board then says, okay, he will be our person. The memo goes to cabinet to appoint the person as CEO of Eskom. Cabinet announces it, the president signs. Who is Mr. Moroka accountable to? On Monday, he's accountable to some amorphous entity called Luthuli House. On Tuesday, he's accountable to the Minister of Public Enterprise. On Wednesday, he's accountable to the board. On Thursday, he's accountable to the Minister of Energy. On Friday, he's accountable to the president. Every day was accountable to somebody else, which meant he was not accountable to anybody. Right? Now, that's the problem with cadre deployment, is it blurs the accountability lines. But it doesn't have to be that way. I was appointed by the president. I was appointed by President Zuma to be deputy governor. I know there were discussions at Luthuli House about who would take over. I'm not naive to that. But on the day that I got appointed, I'm accountable to the governor of the SARB and the board of the SARB only. I was called to Luthuli House. I won't mention names. Said, no, this Post Bank, you must give them a license. So I said, no. Why? Because they haven't applied for one. I was called by a very, very senior politician, said, no, there's an Iranian bank, Bank Pasargad. Can you give them a banking license? I said, no. He says, why? They don't meet the criteria. I made it very, very clear, but not just me, and I was protected by the board and the institution, that I might have been appointed by that, but that's not where my accountability lies. If I wanted, I could be accountable to somebody else every day and I could do whatever I like. Right? And that's the problem with cadre deployment and the issue around the accountability chain. There has to be an accountability chain, or else we can all just do whatever we want. Can we take one more hand? Or 2 more?
No, thank you once again. Just one comment from my side. You know, if you look at the Eskom case, what would have worked if government said to Eskom, we want you to go and electrify so many people, but leave it to Eskom how to do that. So when you talk about an autonomous bureaucracy, you set goals, but allow the bureaucracy to then work on the toolbox that allows it to achieve that. So I think that is what we are likely to get with the professionalization process that is happening, where the principals will tell us what results are required, but allow us as leaders in the public administration to then work out the modalities of how to get there. Because the problem is that once the results are set, there is still contestation on how to get there. So we can't have that. And that is what helped the East Asian nations to develop the way they did. They trusted their bureaucracy, they got people with skills, and they allowed them room to function. Thank you.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'll give you another example. So I was privileged to join the Treasury in a cohort of people. Lungisa Pakamani, it was Omega, it was Ilyas Masilela, Logan was there at the time. You know, so Pakamani becomes the CEO of ESCOM. And they say, no, you must go and run ESCOM. So Pakamani says, we're making a 20 billion rand loss. We're going to have a wage freeze. Right? So the unions jump up. You can't have a wage freeze. So the minister goes behind Pakamani's back and he goes and he negotiates a salary increase at Lutuli House. And he comes back and he sits next to Pakamani in a press conference and he announces the salary increase. Right? My friend Pakamani has got a spine, so he resigned in a week. Right? But that's the problem, right? That our political culture doesn't understand what operational independence means. He was given the job, end load shedding, fix the balance sheet, literally in 6 months, right? The minister intervened behind his back, did something, Pakamani walked. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, it's been lovely. I hope I've provoked you. I hope I made a few of you angry. Thank you.
We may need you to not even sit, Kuben, because I'm now calling upon my colleague, Pindile, DDG, and the NSG to wrap up and do our vote of thanks.
Okay. It's afternoon now. Good afternoon, colleagues. This was very interesting and very thought-provoking and inspiring for us as public servants. I'm sure it's the same feeling all around. I want to thank you, Ben, for making the time to be with us. And based on what, as we were walking, from second floor down here, I want to also announce the fact that you've agreed to be a fellow at the NSG. So we're looking forward to having you doing more of these masterclasses. And we want to have a yearly one on this particular topic, but there will be other topics that we'll talk about. So thank you very much for the opportunity to work with us as a school and making sure that we invoke thought leadership within the public service. Can we give him a round of applause? We also want to thank our respondents, starting with our Director General from Limpopo, Mr. Nape Chabile. We thank you so much. You also a regular here, and we appreciate your support on the work that the NSG is doing. We also want to thank National Commissioner from Public Service Commission, Ms. Nancy Ngwenya. Thank you for being here and for your thoughts, as well as Dr. Robert Nguna is also a permanent person here. So we thank you for always being a part of us as we do the work. And more importantly, it's all of you for attending. This masterclass will not be successful if you are not here physically, and those that are online. We acknowledge all of you and we thank you for participating. And we hope you continue engaging with us as the NSG on this. I want to also promote a linked program to this. There's an evidence-based policymaking program that you can attend at the NSG. Please check it out. Check out our website or call our contact center for more information on this. So we link a masterclass to the actual learning so that we can see how we can apply that. I will now ask our principal to come forward to help us with the gifts for our guests.
Unless it's a box of chocolates, I can't accept it.
We'll start with Kuben.
Yeah. So you can say you've been through the NSG and you've got the cap. So
Thank you.
you can wear this at the gym. Yeah. No, thank you. Thanks.
Thank
for
you.
coming.
Stefan. Can she come up front here so she can also have a good photo, please? Okay, thank you so much, Principal. That marks the end of our masterclass. We hope to see you again at the NSG soon. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon. Thank you.